The snow fell quietly over Riverrun the night Robb Stark made his declaration. Lords muttered under their breath, the air thick with the scent of wine, smoke, and unease. It wasn't like the last time when he was named king in the north by a hall of grieving, vengeful men. This time was different. This time, Robb stood taller, eyes sharper, words heavier. My father was Warden of the North, yes. But he was also Hand of the King, and they butchered him like a traitor. My sisters are prisoners. The capital is ruled by liars and the Iron Throne. It belongs to no man worthy of it. So hear me now. I will no longer be king of the North. Alone, I claim all of Westeros. I will unite this realm or die with my sword buried in its heart. The hall went silent. Some gasped, others scowled. Lord Karstark was the first to speak. Your Grace, we followed you for justice, not madness. You'd claim the whole realm? With what army? Robb didn't flinch. We've fought Lannisters and crushed their men. We've held the Riverlands and made allies. What do you think this war is for? To be left alone in the cold while the wolves who killed my father still rule in the south? Catelyn Stark stood in the corner, her heart pounding. She had begged her son for patience, for caution. But Robb had changed since the whisper of his father's execution reached his ears. He no longer dreamt of peace. He dreamt of fire, in the synth. Days that followed, messengers were sent across the kingdoms. Scrolls sealed with the direwolf sigil arrived in Dorne, the Stormlands, the Vale. They read not of vengeance, but of conquest. Robb Stark had declared himself king of Westeros, challenger to the Iron Throne. In King's Landing, Queen Cersei's hands trembled as she read the Raven's message. The boy plays at war again. Let him. He'll die like his father. Tyrion knew better. He's not just calling himself King of the North anymore. This changes the game. The other kingdoms might listen, and some did. House Arryn refused to answer Lady Lysa, too paranoid to see beyond her walls. The Tyrells sent a polite rejection to invest it in their new alliance with the crown. But Dorne whispered. Prince Doran read the message in the Water Garden's face unreadable. Perhaps it's time Westeros remembers what the wolves are capable of. Back in the Riverlands, Robb gathered his bannermen. Their faces were hard, doubtful, but loyal. Even if they thought the boy had gone too far, they would follow. Because Robb Stark had become more than a symbol, he had become a force. I won't rule with just northern steel, he told them. I will free my sisters, I will tear down the Lannister lie. And I will sit the throne not just because I want it, because Westeros needs a king who knows justice. It was a bold move. Some called it suicide. Others called it destiny. But the moment Robb Stark raised the silver and black banner, direwolf across all 7 kingdoms, the war changed. No longer was he a boy king fighting for the North. He was a conqueror now, and Westeros was watching the banners of House Stark. Now embroidered with silver thread and stitched against a black field, began to appear beyond the Riverlands. They hung not just in the north anymore, but fluttered in secret over towns that whispered rebellion in Tumbleton, in Fair Market, even as far south as Duskendale. Robb's message was clear. It had taken root in the cracks of a broken realm. But war for a throne was different from war for revenge. Robb learned that quickly. He sat with his mother and his most trusted bannerman in the great hall of Harrenhal. Now under his command, the castle still stank of charred stone and old blood ghosts of the past refusing to leave. The mood was tense. Men like Lord Bolton and Lord Karstark shifted uncomfortably under the weight of what Robb was asking of them. We have to move south, Robb said, voice firm. If we remain here, we give the Lions time to regroup. Stannis is still weakened at Blackwater. The throne is vulnerable. Marching south is suicide, said Rickard Karstark, his eyes burning. We've held strong because we stayed in. Our lands go beyond, and we'll be surrounded on all sides." Roose Bolton's voice was low, slithering. "You may call yourself King of Westeros, Your Grace, but titles mean little if your army starves in the Reach or burns in the Crown Lands." Robb looked between them. "You're afraid? I understand. But if we do not take King's Landing, we will always be hunted, always fighting. The wolves must become predators, not prey." Catelyn watched her son with a strange ache in her heart. He was not the boy she'd raised in Winterfell. This Robb had teeth, but he also had a wife, Talisa, sat beside him, eyes scanning the war maps with concern. "They'll never forgive you for marrying me," she whispered that night in their tent. "You broke an oath." "I made a new one," Robb said, brushing her hair behind her ear. "And when I sit the Iron Throne, they'll remember why. I did it not who I did it with." But in the shadows, his broken promises grew like poison vines. House Frey had remained quiet since the marriage. Too quiet. Lord Walder had not responded to Robb's letters nor his request for troops. Even the Blackfish warned that Frey's silence was worse than Frey anger. "They're not ignoring you, nephew," Brynden Tully said as they rode together along the Trident. "They're plotting. That old man has too many daughters and too little." Pride still, Robb pressed south. He took Maidenpool with barely a fight. He raided the Crown Lands and burned the Lannister storehouses near Cracklaw Point. For a moment, it seemed the realm was bending. But then came the Raven. From the Eyrie, it bore the seal of House Arryn, but the words were not Lysa's. "The Vale stands neutral. Any attempt to pass through our mountains will be considered an act of war." Robb slammed his fist into the table. "So be it. If they won't join us, they'll stand aside. We'll march through the Kingswood instead." And so the young wolf carved a path through the realm. Not just as a symbol of the North's fury, but as a storm threatening the capital. But with every mile gained, he lost something. More supplies, more men, and the support of houses that had once praised him as a hero. Word had already spread to King's Landing. Cersei watched the firelight dance across her goblet and sneered. "The North thinks it can rule. Let them come. Let the wolves walk into the lion's den." Joffrey laughed. "I want his head on a spike next to his father's. I want to kill his wolf myself." But Tywin said nothing. He simply folded the latest letter from Lord Walder Frey and smiled. Because Robb Stark was winning battles, but he had made too many enemies, and they were waiting for him to crown himself in blood. The march through the Kingswood was slower than Robb expected. Rain turned the dirt roads to rivers of mud, and the thick canopy above blocked even moonlight. The trees felt like eyes, watching, judging. The men grew restless, exhausted from long nights without proper sleep and days filled with tension. Wolves weren't meant to rule forests. They were meant to prowl open plains. But Robb Stark pressed on. He had no choice. Word came that Stannis Baratheon was gathering strength again on Dragonstone. The Lannisters, despite their wealth, were bleeding from too many sides. Yet Robb knew time was not his ally. The longer he lingered, the more ground he lost, not just in war, but in loyalty. Men don't follow kings forever. Lord Umber growled one night by the fire. They follow strength. We need a victory soon, or they'll start questioning everything. The news from the twins didn't help either. Lord Walder Frey still hadn't responded. Not to requests for passage. Not to the offer of titles and lands in exchange for renewed loyalty. The silence was cold. Lisa noticed the weight in Robb's shoulders growing heavier by the day. "You haven't smiled in weeks," Elisa told him, wrapping a shawl around herself in their tent. "There's nothing to smile about." Robb replied, "You declared yourself king of all Westeros, and now you look like a man waiting for a blade to his throat." "I'm not waiting for it," he said grimly. I just know it's coming." Back in King's Landing, Tywin Lannister had begun weaving his web, not with swords, but with letters, promises, and bribes. He knew the North couldn't win a war of attrition. And more importantly, he knew men's hearts were easily turned with gold, or fear, or vengeance. It started small, a raven to the Freys, then another to the Boltons. Roose Bolton, ever the calculating man, didn't refuse. He didn't accept either. He simply began asking questions, quietly, carefully. Meanwhile, Robb's army reached the outskirts of Rosby. The town was small, but loyal to the crown. Robb's forces stormed it within hours, putting the garrison to the sword. It was a show of strength, but it sent shockwaves through the realm. A northern king executing crown loyalists in the crown lands. To some, it looked like justice. To others, tyranny. By the time Robb reached Duskendale, he received a letter from Sansa. Her handwriting was shaky, but the words were sharp. "They use me like a hostage, but I am still a Stark. If you come to King's Landing, come fast. They speak of marrying me to a Tyrell boy or worse. Do not let them bury our name." Robb stared at the parchment for a long time. "She's alive," he whispered. Catelyn was cautious. It could be a trap, smells of Cersei's schemes, or it could be my sister crying for help. Catelyn wanted to scream. Her son, once so patient and clever, was now chasing ghosts. He was bleeding for the throne. Yes, but bleeding faster inside. Every step closer to King's Landing was a step further from who he once was. Still, they pushed on. Deserters began to grow in number. Few men from the Vale, a minor river lord and his knights. Rumors spread of wildlings breaching the wall of dragons in the east, of strange shadows killing kings in the night. It didn't matter. Robb had made his choice. He stood before his bannermen, just outside of Sal's Horn, and addressed them. "You followed me when I wore no crown. You bled for me when all I had was a wolf on my banner. But now, I ask more. I ask you to follow me to the capital, to the Iron Throne itself. We will not stop. Not until the North is safe, the South is free of liars, and my father's name is avenged." The men cheered. But behind their cheers was doubt. And somewhere in the Westerlands, Lord Frey dipped his quill in ink and scribbled one word beneath a golden lion's seal. Yes. The dawn broke cold over Sal's Horn, but Robb Stark didn't feel it. He was too deep in thought, staring over the hills toward the southern horizon. Somewhere beyond those mists, King's Landing rose like a beast of stone and fire, bloated, with secrets and poisoned crowns. He didn't fear it, no. Robb had lost the capacity for fear when his father's head fell to the executioner's blade. But what haunted him now wasn't death. It was trust. "Roose Bolton has grown quieter," Catelyn said beside him. "He sends fewer ravens. He asks strange questions." "I know," Robb muttered. "Do you trust him?" Silence answered. For him, but it was too late to turn back. They marched again, this time skirting the Blackwater Rush. His scouts reported that Lannister troops had abandoned many of the outer posts. Some claimed it was a trap. Others believed the capital was stretched to thin. Joffrey, too young, Cersei too prideful, and Tywin too far. Still, they moved like ghosts, quick and ruthless. The people along the roads didn't fight. Most didn't cheer either. They simply watched. Poor folk, beaten down by taxes and war and the endless games of the highborn. To them, Robb wasn't a king. It was just another army moving south, claiming righteousness while the fields burned. They reached the Storm Road and paused for a day to regroup, and that's when it arrived. A raven from Lord Walder Frey. "Come to the twins. Let us make peace. I will forgive the insult of your broken vow if you give me what is mine. River Run for one of my sons, and a bride for another. Bring your wife if you must. We shall drink and dine as allies once again." The camp went still when the letter was read aloud. Even the howling winds seemed to hold their breath. "I won't go," Talisa said immediately. "He'll kill us." Catelyn nodded. "It smells like a snare." "But Robb." Robb hesitated. "If we deny him now, he'll side with the Lannisters openly. Taya, he holds the twins. He can close the north behind us. You can't seriously consider it," Talisa said. "What? You humiliated him." Publicly, Robb met her eyes. "And I'll apologize. I'll give him River Run if I must. But if we make peace, we gain his men and safe passage. It's worth the risk." It wasn't. But Robb was desperate. Before leaving for the twins, he sent orders to the Blackfish. "Hold River Run. Trust no one. If we do not return within a fortnight, ride for White Harbor and prepare the north for siege." He left Grey Wind. Behind, Talisa had begged him not to bring the direwolf. She feared how the Freys would react to the beast. Robb agreed, against his better instinct. That decision would haunt him. The twins looked like a cage the moment they arrived. Cold towers, narrow gates, stone that swallowed sound. But the Freys were warm, sickeningly so. Laughter, music, roast meats, and flowing wine. Lord Walder greeted them with open arms and dead eyes. "You broke your word, boy," he said to Robb. "But I am a forgiving man, a practical man." He smiled. But behind that smile was rot. The wedding of Edmure Tully and Rosalind Frey went ahead. The betting was loud, the hall was louder. Drums and pipes, toasts and slurred blessings. Robb held Talisa's hand and whispered to her that it would all be over soon, so that they would return to the campaign, so that he would take King's Landing and give her a castle, a life, a future. But he didn't see the signals, didn't see the doors close, didn't see the musicians reach for crossbows, didn't see Catelyn's eyes widen in pure, primal dread until it was too late, until Talisa screamed, until blood hit the stone floors like spilled wine, and the young wolf, the king of all Westeros, was brought to his knees, betrayed not by a stronger army, but by a smiling old man he thought he could appease. The Red Wedding had begun, and it would end. Everything. The music didn't stop, even as men screamed and flesh tore and steel clashed. The damn music played on off-key, out of rhythm, mocking every drop of Stark blood that spilled onto the cold stone floors of the twins. Robb had barely made it to his feet when Talisa collapsed beside him. There was too much blood, her hands clutching at her belly, her eyes wide with shock. She didn't speak. She couldn't. He tried to hold her. He tried to speak her name. But she was already gone, and then came the arrows. They rained from the balconies, from the shadows behind the drapes. Men Robb had toasted with now pulled blades from their belts and cut down Stark bannermen without hesitation. Northern lords cried out, some trying to shield their wives, others drawing steel too late. Catelyn screamed. She lunged at Lord Walder's youngest wife, dragging a knife to her throat. Her voice was raw with grief. "Let him go," she shouted. "Let my son go, or I swear by the old gods and the new, I'll kill her." But Lord Walder barely looked up from his goblet. His face was calm, indifferent. "I already let him go." And with a wave of his hand, the final blow came. Roose Bolton stepped forward from the shadows. His pale eyes met Robb's, blank, emotionless, like he wasn't even part of the slaughter, like he was above it. "The Lannisters send their regards." Robb didn't even flinch. He simply looked toward his mother, toward his dying men, toward the banner that had once borne his hope. Then the blade slid into his heart. Everything went. Still, Catelyn's scream cracked the air before she dragged the knife across the girl's throat, sobbing, begging the gods to take her instead. But the gods were long gone from that hall, and when they slit her throat and tossed her lifeless body beside her son, it was as if the last breath of the North had been silenced too. Word didn't spread immediately. The phrase made sure of that. They fed the wolves to the flames, burned the bodies, and sewed Grey Wind's head onto Robb's decapitated corpse. Then they paraded it on horseback through the gates, laughing. The king in the north, they jeered. The king of all Westeros. But Westeros didn't laugh, not in the north, not in the Riverlands. Even those who didn't support Robb Stark shivered. Something had been broken that night, not just oaths and alliances, but balance, because what Walder Frey and Roose Bolton had done wasn't war. It was betrayal. It was cowardice, was an abomination. And though Tywin Lannister would later boast about the genius of it all, how one stroke of a quill ended a war that thousands of swords could not, he knew deep inside that something ancient had been awakened. The North never forgets, and from the ashes of the Red Wedding, a colder, darker fire would begin to rise, one that would burn cleaner than Robb Stark's dream, one that would not forgive, not ever. The snows came early that year in the north. It wasn't just the weather that chilled the bones, it was the silence. Ravens arrived days after the Red Wedding, their wings heavy with death. Each letter bore the same grim message in different hands. Robb Stark is dead. The king in the north is no more at Winterfell's ruins, where only smoke and broken stones remained. Survivors of the northern cause gathered like ghosts. They didn't cry. Northerners didn't weep in front of strangers. But something inside them shattered. The Karstarks, already divided after the execution of Rickard's sons, scattered. The Umbers retreated behind their walls. House Manderley at White Harbor mourned in silence, Ward Wyman turning his sorrow inward, his rage buried beneath layers of courtly speech and polite grins. And in the Dreadfort, Roose Bolton received his reward, Warden of the North. The parchment was sealed in red wax, signed by the king in King's Landing himself, Jaffrey Baratheon, guided by Tywin's hand. A Lannister dagger dressed as a royal gift. But Roose knew the North would not kneel so easily, no matter what seal the crown gave him. He sent his bastard to root out the remaining Stark loyalists. Ramsay Snow, a boy with no mercy and even less sanity. He hunted the wolves in the shadows, flaying men who whispered Robb's name, burning farms that raised the Stark banner, torturing maesters who had once served at Winterfell. Taught fear began to seep into the northern soil, but not surrender. Far across the sea, Arya Stark learned the truth at a smoky tavern. She had been so close, so painfully close to reuniting with her mother and brother at the Twins. The Hound had planned to ransom her, but even he didn't expect the massacre. When she heard the tale of the wolf's head sewn on a man's body, the songs the phrase sang, the laughing she said nothing, said nothing. That night, as Sandor Clegane slept beside the fire, Arya slipped away into the woods. She found a Frey scout pissing in the bushes. When she returned, her hands were red and her face was blank. The Hound looked at her strangely. "What did you do?" "I took one back," she said. "One of them." And that was just the beginning. Meanwhile, in the Vale, little Sansa Stark, still a hostage in Silkherd, whispers from Tyrion's pages. She had hoped, foolishly. Now hope felt like poison. She sat alone in her chamber and traced her brother's name into the frost on the window. Robb. Dead. She didn't cry either, but something hardened in her. A part of her that had once longed for songs and kisses now longed for something else. Strategy. In the Riverlands, the Blackfish escaped the massacre. With only a few loyal men, he vanished into the hills. Rumor said he was gathering other survivors, that he had sworn a new oath to avenge the king in the north, even if it meant drowning the Riverlands in blood. and Lady Stoneheart rose from death. Catelyn Stark, once the quiet strength behind Robb's rage, had been thrown into the river, with her throat slit. But the gods or something older refused to let her rest. She came back cold, voiceless, merciless, no longer a mother, no longer a lady, just vengeance wrapped in skin. She led the Brotherhood without banners, with a fury that made even the righteous shudder. They hanged Freys from trees. They flayed Boltons. They burned sigils and left warnings carved into corpses. The North remembers. It echoed like a ghost through every canyon and vale. And though Robb Stark had died at the Twins, death had birthed something worse than rebellion. It had awakened the wrath of a people who had once hoped for peace, and now only vengeance would do. Winter crept south like a slow-moving plague, swallowing roads, freezing rivers, and choking the breath from the land. But it wasn't just snow that blanketed Westeros now, it was vengeance. Quiet, creeping, and merciless. In the ruins of Winterfell, the Stark words echoed louder than ever. Winter is coming. Only now, it wasn't a warning. It was a promise. House Bolton held the North, at least on parchment. Roose sat as warden, draped in fine black furs, sipping arbor wine brought in under the Lannister lion. But every day, new cracks spread through his stolen castle. Small folk disappeared at night. Ravens went missing. Men found the flayed corpses of their cousins nailed to trees with traitor carved into their skin. These were Boltons in White Harbor. Lord Wyman manderly plotted. He fed fat to the Lannister envoys, toasted Roose Bolton's name, and quietly sent ships across the sea. Seeking the one Stark still untouched by betrayal, Bronn, his maesters, called him dead. But Wyman believed the boy lived somewhere beyond. The wall, beyond the grasp of traitors and kings, and in the Riverlands. The Brotherhood without banners became a myth soaked in blood. Villagers spoke of masked riders who hanged Freys in the night, burned Bolton keeps, and left no survivors. Leading them was a pale woman with torn skin and no voice. Lady Stoneheart. Some called her a demon, others called her justice. She called herself vengeance, and her list was long. Walder Frey's sons began to fall, one by one. The smiling ones, the drunk ones, the ones who laughed when Robb died. Each of them found with their eyes gouged, or their tongues missing, sometimes both. Back in King's Landing, Tywin Lannister received word of this uprising. He called it a child's rebellion easily crushed. But then came a letter from the Vale. Lysa Arryn was dead, pushed through the moon door, though the truth remained buried. And Sansa Stark vanished, disguised, hidden, protected by Peer Baelish, who played the Game of Thrones better than anyone. He whispered into her ear not of songs or old dreams, but of strategies, alliances, and the slow death of enemies. You are the last true Stark, he told her. The last who can rule, but Sansa had learned. From Cersei, from Tyrion, from loss. She didn't need a man to teach her how to survive. She was a Stark in the East. Arya had become a ghost. In the House of Black and White, she trained her rage. Into silence, her grief into blades. But even as she took the faces of strangers, one name always sat on her lips, whispered at night like a prayer soaked in fire. Walder Frey. And back at the Twins, the old man sat in his hall, smug and aging, surrounded by grandchildren who feared him more than any army. He didn't know death was already at his table. Arya came not with an army, but with a smile and a pie. And a knife when she peeled his face off the next morning. The hall fell silent. The North remembers, she whispered to his corpse. It wasn't just a motto anymore. It was a sentence, a warning. A storm rising from the ice. And as Roose Bolton looked out across his snow-covered walls and saw no ravens return, no bannermen ride in, No word from his bastard. He realized what was coming. Not armies, not politics, but wrath. Because when you kill a king, you expect the war to end. But when you kill Robb Stark, you wake the North, ChatGPT said. Snowdrifts towered like white walls along the King's Road, silent and cold as tombstones. The North was deathly still, but it was not asleep. It had been over a year since Robb Stark died at the Twins, and yet his name still hung in the air like smoke from an old fire. They called him the Young Wolf, the Boy King, the Usurper, the Fool, but none of those names mattered anymore. Because the North was no longer mourning, it was waiting. At Winterfell, Roose Bolton tried to rule. He draped himself in titles, feasted with Lannister envoys, and sent letters sealed in crimson wax to dead allies. But the castle groaned at night. Servants vanished. The shadows seemed to whisper things that chilled even his bastard. Then came the heads. First, the Frey captain stationed at Barrowton found, in his chambers, throat slashed, wolf entrails packed in his mouth. Then a raven arrived from House Manderley, a simple scroll. "You can keep your throne, my lord. We already buried our king. Now we feed the wolves." Roose began locking his doors at night. But it wasn't enough. The first true blow came from the sea at dawn. Ships bearing no sigils docked silently in White Harbor. From them came men in fur, battle-hardened and stone-eyed Manderley warriors, broken lords and exiled sons. At their front was Wyman himself, towering, blood-stained, and grinning like a butcher before the first cut. "I gave my sons to the Freys," he bellowed to a crowd of thousands. "And in return, they gave me silence. No more. From this day forward, no Frey shall eat in my halls. No Bolton shall sleep under my roof. I do not recognize Roose Bolton as warden of anything." The hall exploded with cheers, and then came the wolves. Not literal ones, those had all been hunted, scattered, but men, women, children, raised on tales of Winterfell, raised on the Stark name. They poured from the forests, from broken keeps, from mountain valleys that hadn't seen sunlight in months. No formal armies, no polished shields. Just vengeance, wrapped in cloaks of snow, led by the Blackfish, guided by the Brotherhood, and fed by whispers that a Stark still lived. At the wall, Jon Snow stood in black, his eyes always turned north, but his heart forever south. Word reached him in pieces. Robb dead, Arya gone, Sansa missing, Rickon vanished, Bran lost beyond the frost. But then came the old woman with the broken teeth and one eye. She didn't give her name. She only gave him a message. "Your kin cry out for a Stark. Are you not one?" And with that, the tide turned. Jon rode south with a handful of knights, watched deserters cast out and cursed. He wasn't supposed to interfere. He wasn't supposed to care. But blood is thicker than vows, and Jon Snow had bled enough. By the time he reached the last hearth, a rebellion was already roaring. House Umber had turned, so had the Dustons. Even some Karstarks defied their kin. They no longer fought for Robb's ghost. They fought for themselves, for dignity, for retribution, for the right to choose their own fate. Roose Bolton tried to crush them, but his bannermen had no stomach left. And when Ramsay returned from his hunt, dragging a broken, beaten figure behind him, Roose knew the end had come. The boy was small, wild-eyed, starved, but he bore a name. One Roose had tried to erase from memory. Rickon Stark, the youngest wolf, hidden for years, smuggled out by loyal men, captured by Ramsay, but not broken. When he escaped, he didn't run. He lit the kennels on fire and let the dogs eat their masters. Winterfell burned for 3 nights. On the 4th, Wyman Manderley's forces broke the gates. Roose Bolton was found in the Great Hall, still gripping his wine cup, as if pretending. It wasn't over. They didn't give him a speech. They gave him the same death he gave the North, slow, cold, and full of silence. By morning, the direwolf banner flew again above Winterfell. Tattered, yes, soaked in ash and blood, but still there. Rickon Stark sat beneath it, flanked by old warriors, maesters, even outlaws. He was too young, too unready, too alone. But the North bent the knee anyway, 'cause the Starks had fallen one by one trying to do the right thing. And now it was time to do the necessary thing. Not justice, not peace, survival. They carved a new oath in the stone outside the Great Hall. One that didn't speak of honor or kings or gods, just truth. The North remembers. The North rises. The North endures. And across the realm, even in the golden halls of the capital, men began to whisper again of wolves, and of wolves. Far across the sea, in the twisting alleys of Braavos, Arya Stark stood atop the Titan's watch. The wind off the water cut deep, but she barely noticed. Below, ships came and went, freighters, galleys, slavers, soldiers. Life moved like clockwork, yet she remained still. The names were gone now, the list. Finished, Walder Frey. Dead. Ramsay Bolton. Flayed by his own hounds. Cersei, not yet. But Arya no longer burned for her blood. Something had changed the night she slit Walder's throat. It didn't bring peace, just silence. And in that silence, a whisper grew louder. Home. She left her coin with the kindly man and vanished from Braavos before dawn. She didn't take a ship. She took shadows. War faces were needed. Traveled like smoke. When she reached White Harbor, the guards didn't recognize her at first. She looked older, wilder eyes, colder than the snows that fell. But when she stepped into the Great Hall of Winterfell, Rickon dropped the scroll in his hands. He ran to her. They didn't speak. They just held each other in the ashes of everything they'd lost. South. In the Vale, Pettier Baelish was dead, poisoned, though no one knew by whose hand. Maybe the Maesters, maybe Sansa's. It didn't matter, because the Lords of the Vale now looked to a different banner. Sansa Stark sat on a throne of dark pine and steel. Not as queen, not as lady, simply as warden of the Vale, by right of blood and fury. Her voice no longer trembled when she addressed the lords. Her hands no longer fumbled with rings or ribbons. She was iron, forged in heartbreak. She received ravens from Winterfell. Brothers were alive. Her sister had returned. A new council had formed in the north, but she did not return, not yet. Instead, she sent grain, steel, engineers, and soldiers who bore the snowflake and falcon sigil united. For the first time in generations, because Sansa knew the South would rise again. The Lannisters would scheme, the Reach would turn, and new dragons would soar across the narrow sea. But when that day came, the North and the Vale would stand as one, and this time no one would break them beyond the wall in the haunted woods. Bran Stark opened his eyes. He did not blink, he did not breathe, because he no longer needed to. His body was a shell, now pale and thin, but his mind stretched across centuries, across trees and stones and rivers. He saw Robb's last breath, Arya's tears, Rickon's fire, Jon's doubt, Sansa's defiance. He saw everything, and deep beneath the snow, he saw a shadow moving again, a darkness not yet dead. The night was stirring, and Bran thrived. Half-forgotten Bran smiled, because the wolves were ready. The North remembers. The North rises. The North endures. And when the long night comes again, the North will answer.